Começar. So hello, I'd like to welcome all our guests, our students, our professors today here at FGV. We have the honor today of receiving one of the greatest thinkers in management in the last, it's not an exaggeration to say maybe 30 years. Professor Mintzberg has been at least on the spot for at least 30 years that I remember when I was an undergraduate student and we were already reading books from Henry Mintzberg. And now still here, still debating, still steering the most interesting discussions on management and not only on management, but the whole society. So today we'll have Professor Mintzberg talking to us for about half an hour on his latest book on rebalancing society. And then we will open for questions and to have a session as lively as possible in a more open and informal way. So, Professor Mintzberg, thank you very much, and it's up to you now.
Good, thank you. Maybe we can stop the. Can we stop the? It's very disconcerting when I'm introduced by someone who says he used my books as a student and now he's got gray hair. And it was even worse when please. No. It started really when I began to teach the children of my original students. Now suddenly it's the grandchildren of my original students. So it gets very disconcerting. I am a great fan of FGV. We have been partners for 5 years. In our International Masters in Practicing Management, and the class, some of the members of the class are in fact right here today because our program goes around the world and it has one module of 10 days in each of 5 places, in England, then in Canada, then in Bangalore, India, then in Beijing, China, and finally finishing here in Rio de Janeiro, which I think is not only the most beautiful city in the world, but I couldn't tell you what's number 2. It's so far ahead of every other one that I can't imagine a number 2. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be here in this kind of situation. I'm also a big fan of Brazil. And I'd say that not just because I'm in Brazil. There used to be a comedian, a Danish comedian, and he would say, "It's such a pleasure to be in Ottawa." But I know where I am. I'm in Brazil, and I know that I'm in Rio, and I know that I'm in FGV. So it's wonderful to be here. I'm a fan of Brazil. Despite the problems that are going on now. And frankly, there's a lot of focus on corruption in Brazil, not only within Brazil, but there's also a focus on the corruption in Brazil in other countries. I think to some extent, other countries are sometimes out to get Brazil, out to punish Brazil. After all, you had the nerve to elect a left-wing government yet again. And you're not supposed to do that in today's world. Every government is supposed to be center or right. But Brazil has not only been a kind of left-wing government, but it's also been a government that's had the courage to challenge many other established powers in the world, particularly the way it dealt with HIV/AIDS in this country, and how it challenged international bodies, and how it challenged the pharmaceutical companies, and how it challenged the American government that tried to back up the pharmaceutical companies, as if people are supposed to die so that pharmaceutical companies can make great amounts of profit. And Brazil was one of the countries that kind of said our people and the health of our people is more important. If these drugs are available, they should be available for people who need them. Certainly pharmaceutical companies deserve profit, but the question is how much profit and compared to our needs. So let me ask you a question. Which country has worse corruption, Brazil or the United States? And let me tell you what I think the difference is. I think the United States is far more corrupt, but the corruption in the United States is legal, and the corruption in Brazil is criminal. And criminal corruption is much easier to deal with than legal corruption, because criminal corruption, people can be put in jail, they can be fined, they can be punished. Legal corruption, you can't do anything with. So the situation with regard to elections in the United States and the amount of money that is private money that has been entering American elections is unacceptable in any democracy, and is obscene, and yet the Supreme Court of the United States gave carte blanche to do that. The lobbying that goes on in the American Congress, of course, there's lobbying that goes on everywhere in the world, but the extent of lobbying, and maybe I'm a little harsh on the United States, not only because I'm Canadian and we're supposed to be harsh on our neighbor, but because America was the model. For 200 years, America was the model. America was the place everybody looked up to. And you either went to America because you admired it so much, or else you tried to get your country to imitate America. And that was common for a long time, and now suddenly that model is breaking down, and people are looking for other models. And the trouble is they're looking in the wrong places. They're looking in ISIS and other forms of religious fanaticism, which is obviously not good. They're looking in populism in many countries, where they're looking to populist governments, as Egypt did, as Thailand did, as Venezuela did, and so on. In the United States itself or in Canada, people are looking to corporate social responsibility with the assumption that if we fix capitalism, we'll fix the world. And capitalism definitely needs to be fixed. But as I'll talk about, there's more than that needs to be fixed. Or other people in the United States are turning to government, as people more in the center or the left have always done. They expect government to solve the problems. The trouble today is that governments are so overwhelmed by private interests or by globalization forces, which are unregulated, that we're running into, that they're running into huge problems trying to express their independence. The interesting thing about Brazil, and the thing I most admired about Brazil, is Brazil has been prepared to stand up to international forces when it mattered to it. For example, as I mentioned earlier, with the HIV/AIDS crisis and other things, Brazil has been one of the most courageous and few courageous governments to stand up to forces that are quite negative. And my fear is that with the current crisis, Brazil will back off and become correct, or become polite, or become disciplined, and not play the role it's played. I think that Brazil has more chance of showing the way to a better world than any other country in the world. Partly because it's large, partly because it's been courageous, partly because it's quite an independent country. The fact that you speak a language that nobody else speaks in Latin America, almost nobody else speaks in the world except small country of Portugal, means that you have a kind of tight kind of society. You're also a society, I think, that has a strong sense of community, a strong sense of what people can do in civil society, which I'll call in a minute the plural sector. And it's very impressive here, and it's very strong here. The other thing that's most impressive about Brazil, I think, and I did an article with Guy Azevedo, who was a why am I looking for the name? People from Rio, Carioca. Guy was my doctoral student, and he's a Carioca. And we did an article together about the why not people of Brazil. Brazil is a kind of why not country. It's kind of like, yeah, sure, anything goes, whatever, you know, we'll do anything. And too many of the places in the world are why places. What made America, what made the United States so great for 200 years, it was a why not country. It was a country in which anything goes, anything could be done, anything could be conquered. And America remains a why not country in its private sector, in its business sector. Its entrepreneurship in America is still amazing and fantastic. But in government, America has become a why country. Why should we do that? Why do we need Obamacare? Why should we stop guns? Why should we do this? Why should we do that? And there's so much paralysis in the American government today that it's sad to watch. And Brazil remains, I think, a why not country, not only in business, but especially in its civil society or in its plural sector. There's just so many things going on that are interesting. It's almost reached a point where when I hear somebody talk about some new initiative, some new idea, some new ways of doing things in the population, almost before they tell me where it is, I'm inclined to say, I'll bet it's Brazil. Because maybe half the time it is Brazil. It's quite amazing what goes on in this country, and so many interesting things are going on in this country. And that's why I worry, for my sake, for the sake of my children and my grandchildren, I worry that you'll lose that because of the pressures you're now experiencing on the economic side and the criminal corruption side. And please don't lose that, because we need you everywhere around the world. So I'll get a bit more formal here if I can figure out how this works. I guess if I hit this side, it works. Whoops, a little too well. I can't get the middle one. That's funny. So have a good look at that. I bought that book some years ago, the Communist Manifesto. I wanted to look at it and see what Marx and Engels really said. And then I put it aside for a few years. And then I picked it up and I looked at the cover and I said, oh my God, look at this. Do you see what's going on there? It says 2 for the price of 1. And Karl Marx must have been turning in his grave when he saw that. But this is the two sides of the world today. You know, we've got the left-wing communist side, and then slap right in the middle of it, we have the right-wing capitalist side, 2 for the price of 1. Not too serious or damaging, but amusing nonetheless. Not long ago, think back. Nobody ever thinks back. I think our collective memories run about 2 months or maybe 2 days. Everybody know about Volkswagen and Volkswagen's games with the diesel engines? Everybody knows about that. Well, do you remember? You knew about it. Did you think about it? That if you're not going to buy a Volkswagen next time, will you buy a Chevrolet? Watch out for the ignition switches because they could kill you. Okay? Or maybe you should buy a Toyota, but duck. In English, you say duck when the airbag comes your way because it could kill you. You remember that? When I tell you, you remember, but you probably didn't remember, and you might go out and buy a Toyota because, after all, look what diesel engines are doing now. The problem is not Volkswagen. The problem is not General Motors. The problem is not Toyota. The problem is very widespread. And you know what's a good indication of the problem? The fact that there was an article appeared recently in the New York Times, and I had the same feeling actually before they said that one of the problems at Volkswagen was the chief executive was obsessed with becoming the biggest car company in the world. It wanted to pass Toyota. So he put pressure on people. He didn't tell people to cheat on the tests. He simply put pressure on people, which led people, some of them, to cheat on the tests. If they had to sell so many cars, after all, maybe they could sell more this way. Now, how many people remember, if you read the New York Times or the popular press about 6 or 8 years ago, Toyota did exactly the same kind of thing when its chief executive was obsessed with being number one. You know, when its chief executive was being number one. So this is a problem. I wrote an article recently. I said this is not a scandal, it's a syndrome. It's a syndrome that cuts across so many businesses. And now we're talking about Germany, and General Motors, we're talking about the US, and Toyota, we're talking about Japan, and you can go to almost any country. There are wonderful businesses all over the place that don't do these things, but there's more and more of this, and it's becoming extremely serious and dangerous. I think the real problem are those people in General Motors who knew that these ignition switches were killing people, and did nothing about it. That is manslaughter. That is a form of murder. If somebody is dying and you are not intervening to stop it, you are party to that crime. Those people at General Motors belong in jail. You know, there was legislation passed in the US Congress to protect the automobile companies from criminal charges, from criminal prosecutions. So they kind of built a thing around General Motors, around all the automobile companies, where the government couldn't prosecute. But murder's okay if you do it in an automobile company. Somebody was saying, of course, that Volkswagen may be responsible in a way for murder as well, because many people die from asthma and other lung diseases, and that is made worse by diesel engines that are spewing out 40 times as much junk as they were supposed to be in the tests. So it wasn't long ago that democracies were proliferating. Think about it, 15, 20 years ago. We were amazed at how many countries were suddenly becoming democratic, suddenly holding elections. It was wonderful. How many of you remember when the Arab Spring was flowering and people were in the streets in Tahrir Square in Cairo and in Tunisia, and everybody was so enthusiastic about that? Do you remember when developing countries were developing? And in Africa, particularly, a number of countries were, and of course Brazil and many others. And do you remember Yes We Can? That you remember, when Barack Obama ran a campaign calling Yes We Can. When was the last time you heard Yes We Can? What you hear from Congress these days is no, we cannot. Can't do anything. Now you've got turmoil in the Middle East. You've got thugs in presidential palaces. I'm including Putin and lots of others, and Venezuela and so on. You've got racism going across Europe, of all places now, and you've got political paralysis in the United States. What happened? I think 1989 happened. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And you know what? It fell on us. It fell on the whole world, because it freed the Eastern Europeans of the scourge of communism, and it created a situation that we're suffering from today. And have to be very delicate. The conclusion in 1989, particularly in the US, but around the world, was that capitalism had triumphed. Remember that, if you're old enough to remember that. You don't need gray hair to remember that. Capitalism triumphed in 1989. That was the conclusion, and it was dead wrong. It was absolutely and utterly wrong. What triumphed? The Eastern European countries collapsed because they were out of balance. Balance triumphed in 1989 in two respects. The Eastern European countries were utterly out of balance on the side of their public sectors. I don't know if moving it back will help. They were utterly out of balance on the side of their public sectors. Governments controlled so much. Governments controlled big business. There was not much private big business. Government controlled civil society by making sure that other kinds of organizations couldn't exist. And you see it today in China, where the communist government is not very happy with independent associations. They try and stop Google, and they try and stop Tiananmen Square protests, and so on and so forth. But the other thing that triumphed in 1989 was balance on our side, that we in the West and the developed and wealthy countries in the world, the democratic ones, were rather balanced. We had strong private sectors, no question. We had strong governments, much stronger. And we had strong plural sectors, strong civil society. We were balanced. And if you think about the United States before 1989, after World War II, before 1989, there were welfare programs that were very generous, introduced by Lyndon Johnson. Tax rates were much higher. The disparities between the wealthy and the poor were much less than they are now. And yet the country in that period experienced fantastic development and growth politically, economically, and socially. The country was an American democracy domestically. There was Vietnam, which is not very pretty history, but America was balanced internally. Now look at what's going on. You've got income disparities that are huge. In Brazil, they were starting to shrink. In America, they're growing and growing and growing. We've got low taxation rates, decreasing taxation rates. So Mitt Romney, who ran for president, paid less tax than his secretary was paying in a percentage. And we've got a Congress that is absolutely frozen, or not Congress is frozen, but a US governmental system that's frozen. America, as I say, is suffering greatly from legal corruption, and it's suffering because we believe that capitalism triumphed, and therefore capitalism is all things good. A fellow named Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, which has to be the most arrogant book, I think, ever written. And essentially American, and essentially what he said is that America, or the world, had reached perfection thanks to our capitalistic system. And he proved to be right. Capitalism has triumphed, and unfortunately, which has thrown us out of balance, and we may well see the end of history if we don't do something about global warming. So we may well see the end of history, but not the way he thought it. So what's this perfection that we had? I'll get there. We're basically dominated by a dogma that says greed is good. You remember the famous movie about, I forget his name, made this very great speech about greed is wonderful, markets are sacrosanct, property is sacred, and governments are suspect. And that became the overriding model. And as one view of human nature, it makes sense. You can see sort of characteristics of that. You know, greed is good because it does stimulate economic activity, and markets are wonderful where there's real competitive markets, and property is sacred. This is my jacket and you can't have it. It's mine. And governments are suspect. Of course, governments do all kinds of things that we don't like. As one view of human nature, it makes sense. As the view of human nature, it's nonsense. As the view of human nature, which is what traditional economic theory was taught to so many people, It's complete nonsense that anybody could believe that that's all there is to human nature. You know, economists who say there's no such a thing as empathy, there's no such a thing as generosity, I want to say to them, what kind of mother did you have? Like, did you have a mother? I mean, mothers are generous and empathetic. I mean, most mothers are generous and empathetic, and they care only about their children. But these guys must have had awful mothers if they think there's no such a thing as generosity or empathy. So the result, America's leading this, but it's by no means alone. And there are people all over the world driving this kind of agenda. But look at some statistics in the United States. Incarceration rates, the highest in the world, in jail. Obesity, huge in America. Drug use, very, very high in the United States. Voter turnout, surprisingly low. Income disparities growing. And the most shocking of all is social mobility. For 200 years, people moved to America for social mobility so that their children, they arrived poor, they were prepared to be poor. Even these mothers came with the idea that they would be poor if their children could be wealthy and successful. These ungenerous mothers, the ones who, at least the ones who didn't have economists as children, people moved to America because of social mobility. Well, look at the figures on social mobility today. America's significantly behind many of the developed countries now. Canada, which has always been a very democratic country, but not as famous for social mobility, I think the last figures are that a child has 4 times as much chance of getting ahead in Canada as that child does in the United States. I'm not saying America's all bad. I'm saying America's in the front of a trend that is happening in the entire world. And believe me, it's coming here, as it's been coming everywhere else. And it's 10 years ago when we got a government that looks very much like George Bush's government in the United States. And 60% of the Canadian population that split their votes between 2 center and left-wing parties were shocked by what happened in our own country. Our own country was sold, basically, and now we're in an election to try and correct that. So it's not just America, but America's taking the lead, and unless somebody stops it, it's coming everywhere. Globalization has no significant regulation. So global companies have a lot of freedom with very little regulation, and the international agencies that should be controlling this are cheerleaders for all this economic dogma. The IMF, the World Bank, the organization, the OECD, the World Bank, IMF, World Bank, OECD, and the World Trade Organization. You know, the World Trade Organization heard a case some years ago about genetically modified foods. And the Europeans want to stop genetically modified foods. And some countries, including Canada, I'm hesitant to say, took them to the World Trade Organization court and lost. The World Trade Organization said you have no right to stop this. Well, what the hell is the World Trade Organization doing deciding on health issues? Where was the World Health Organization? All our powerful international agencies are cheerleaders for this kind of economic dogma. They may have moderated their stand somewhat, but they still stand for that economic view. They don't stand for social needs. They stand for economic needs. So that's the world we're living in. So we have to go from exploiting resources to exploring our resourcefulness. I am not a human resource. I'm a human being. I am not human capital. I am not a human asset. I'm a human being. And we've got to get rid of demeaning vocabulary. So this is the political world as we've known it for over a century, when in the French assemblies, the ancien regime, the establishment, sat on the right, and the commoners sat on the left. And ever since then, politics has been a straight line between left and right, and between public and private, between communism and capitalism, between Karl Marx and Adam Smith. Not the Adam Smith of his most important book, but a few paragraphs of the Adam Smith of The Wealth of Nations. Because if you read the rest of Adam Smith, it's not consistent with that view. Nationalization of industry on the one side, privatization of industry on the other side. And what we have in many countries now is either a pendulum politics, as France has, swinging from left to right. So you go from Sarkozy to Hollande, back to Sarkozy, back to Hollande, and you're swinging back from left to right, and nothing much changes. Or you have what's in the United States, which is paralysis in the political center. So you can't get things done in the political center. That's kind of what we're facing politically. So, whoops. So how about that? There's a problem with the PowerPoint. It's the last words are hidden underneath, but I'll tell you. We need to take the straight line and fold it over into a circle. Okay? We need to look at society as a stool, like a stool you sit on, and you can't sit on one leg. Communism tried to sit on one leg, the public sector leg. And America today is trying to sit on one leg, which is the private sector leg. And China is trying to sit on two legs, which is the business and government. And they're all unstable. But a society has to sit on three legs. And one leg is the public sector, and one leg is the private sector. And it's missing, but one leg is what I call the plural sector. You know it as civil society, or NGOs, non-government organizations, or the third sector as if it's third rate, and so on. A healthy society balances strong, respected governments, responsible enterprises, and robust community organizations in the plural sector. The plural sector is largely community, not exclusively. There we go. So what do I mean by the plural sector? I basically mean organizations that are not owned by government and they're not owned by private investors. There are two kinds. They're owned by their members. You could say a church is owned by its members, but cooperatives are owned by their members. Cooperatives. Do you know how much membership of cooperatives there is in the United States? The United States has about 310 million people and about 350 million cooperative memberships. America is a land of cooperatives, not just of businesses. Of course, cooperatives are businesses, but America is significantly a land of cooperatives, as is every country. But we don't talk about it. We know it, but we don't think about it. The plural sector is hidden. It's forgotten because there's no room on a straight line between left and right. There's no room for the plural sector. There's only room for private and public. There's no room for the plural sector. But if we turn it around and make it into a circle, there's room for it. And why do I call it plural? For two reasons. First of all, the variety of organizations is huge. And second of all, we need a word so that we can say public-private plural and recognize that plural has to take its place alongside public and private. There are also social movements, social associations in the plural sector, like social movements, as we saw on Wall Street or Tahrir Square in Cairo, and social initiatives, which are ideas to try and change things. Somebody said there's 1 million social initiatives in the world today. He wrote that 5 years ago. There's probably 2 million. Now, probably everybody in this room is involved with something. Maybe you're helping to feed the poor or driving some elder people around who need help, or you could be doing all kinds of things. My guess is everybody in this room has probably been involved with a plural sector organization, or 5 of them this week. If you went to the YMCA to swim, if you gave money to Greenpeace, if you shopped in a cooperative, we're all very involved, and yet we don't think of that sector. There's only two, public-private, and yet there's three. When de Tocqueville wrote a book, two books, two-part book called Democracy in America, and he wrote it in the 1930s. As a Frenchman, he visited America. Sorry, 1830s, minor difference, quibble. When he wrote in the 1830s, 180, 90 years ago, almost 2 centuries ago, he wrote that associations, and he meant plural sector associations, were key to American democracy. Were key to American democracy. So he had this idea of 3 sectors long before anybody else did, and he saw that as key to American democracy. Brazil is a land of plural sector initiatives. I'm amazed, I said it earlier, but I'm always amazed at how much goes on. When it was dealing with HIV/AIDS, you had organizations of hemophiliacs, you had organizations of gay people, you had government involved. You had not only plural sector, but you had cooperation between public, private, and plural. I spent this morning at Fiocruz, your healthcare organization, which is technically public sector, but kind of runs like plural sector. It seems to have a lot of autonomy, and it was involved with developing the drugs for HIV/AIDS in this country, in opposition to the drug companies and the American government that tried to stop Brazil from doing it. I went to a conference. Ricardo Semler, who was a friend of mine, I ran a group called DNA Brazil, where he brought the 50 of the most well-known thinkers of Brazil together every year to talk about issues. And somebody at that conference, I forget the name of the organization, but it's the organization that seizes farmland of rich people that's not being used, and they occupy the farmland and grow their crops on this private farmland. And he was giving out the jams and jellies that they made in this farmland. In where I come from, that guy would be in jail. In Brazil, he's like a hero. So for some people anyway, not everybody, not the landowners, I guess. So what goes on in this country is absolutely amazing. And that's what saddens me, if the country gets the disease that other countries are getting and goes out of balance. This is a balanced country. You have a very strong private sector. You have a very activist public sector, and you have an amazing, absolutely amazing plural sector in this country. I never cease to be amazed at how activist it is. Each of the sectors by itself is dangerous. So if it's all public sector, you have communism. You can't balance the society on that one leg. If it's all private sector, you have capitalism, which is proving no better. It's too one-sided. And if it's just plural sector, it's a kind of Nazism. Nazism was a community-based organization in Germany or in Italy. In a sense, it was a plural sector kind of organization. So you can't have any sector dominating, no matter which. I love business. I think business is wonderful. I drive a wonderful Honda car. I got a terrific iPhone. I eat at wonderful restaurants. I love the private sector in the private sector, supplying me with goods and services. If a businessman comes to me and says, I want to be more socially responsible, what should I do? I say, start by getting your company out of my government. Start by getting your company out of my government. You have no business interfering. You as an individual have as much right as I as an individual have. You as a company, you with money have no more business influencing government than some guy in the street. That's corporate social responsibility. Stick to your own place, which is goods and services for business, protection for government and community institutions for the plural sector. So how do we? I'll finish quickly, but How do we get radical renewal? We're not going to get it from corporate social responsibility. I applaud it. I think we need more of it. I think every company should do what it can to be socially responsible. But in today's world, there is so much corporate social irresponsibility that it won't compensate. It won't compensate. What Volkswagen just did will not be compensated by Walmart going green. What Walmart does to unions is a lot more significant than what Walmart does going green. And governments will not get us out of this mess now, because governments are so overwhelmed by private sector forces, or so overwhelmed by globalization forces, that they can't do anything. Canada drops its tax rate to 15% for corporations, and now we have a center-left opposition party saying we'll raise it to 17%. I'm thinking 15 is the lowest in the world, and we're going to go up to 17. Wow, that's going to make a big difference. This is the world we live in. I think we have to look to the plural sector for change. And that means you, and that means me, and that means us together. What concerns me about the plural sector is, as I say, it's huge, it's significant, we're all involved with it, but as a force, it's extremely weak. Greenpeace and all the others were in Rio de Janeiro for the last global warming conference, and look what they accomplished, 0. We had the G7 meeting, the 7 significant economies of the world meeting, and what was their result? That we will get rid of fossil fuels by 2010, by 2100. We will get rid of fossil fuels by 2100. And the press reported this without laughing. The press reported this without laughing. In 85 years, we'll get rid of fossil fuels. These politicians were sitting there. Are they going to be there in 85 years saying, see, we did it? There's going to be 20 or 30 governments in every one of those countries. Nobody's responsible for anything. And yet even the CBC, which is a very liberal kind of network in Canada, even the CBC was reporting this as if it was serious. You have to laugh. If it wasn't so sad, you have to laugh. 85 years to get rid of fossil fuels. We'll be dead. We'll be dead. So the big question for me, and I'll end in a minute, say some words about Brazil, but the big question for me is, how do we get our act together to rebalance society? How does the plural sector work, and how does it work with people, what a friend of mine calls the good folks of America? And he's a right-wing, kind of moderate, conservative guy, and he talks about the good folks of America. How do the good folks of America work together with the plural sector and government to rebalance society? So some quick words on Brazil, and then I talked about balance in Brazil. I talked about the vibrancy of the plural sector. People refer to Brazil as a developing country. You know what? When it comes to the plural sector, Brazil is a hell of a lot more developed than any other country I know. Brazil is the most developed country, I think, socially, in terms of the plural sector. I talked about the why not people of Brazil. People who's, I met a woman in Montreal, a Brazilian woman, and she says, when you Canadians get together on Saturday night, you have to know what restaurant you're going to and what time you're going and what movie you're going to or what theater you're going to. She said, we Brazilians just get together and say, what do we feel like doing? I'm not going to try and pronounce that. I'm going to read my cheating. It says that I should say, Zay Shin Yu. Something like that, but you know what I mean. America was the why not people. Americans were the why not people of the world. They still are in the private sector. American enterprise and entrepreneurship is amazing, absolutely amazing. But in the public sector, and the plural sector is not bad, but Americans were the why not people. America could do anything. And now suddenly there's this pall over the country, this kind of, we can't deal with our problem. We can't get rid of guns. We can't do this. We can't do that. And it's sad. And Brazil still has that. And so my message to you is don't lose it. You've got something that is so unique in the world and so powerful in the world and so necessary for everybody, yourselves and everybody else. Don't lose it. So let me just conclude. Tom Paine wrote a famous pamphlet for the American Revolution that helped to stimulate the American Revolution. And he said, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And he was right. They did start the world over again. Well, we have to do it again. And why not Brazil? Thank you.
So I would like to thank Henry for this inspiring and very positive words. And I would like to open for the public for questions. There's one.
Way in the back.
Way back.
Hi, my name is Rafael, and I work for Rio de Janeiro City Hall. In Brazil, legislation makes almost impossible for public sector and private sector, and maybe the plural sector, you said, to cooperate. What do you think that can be made in Brazil to make strong the cooperation between those sectors?
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question. You know, my understanding of the HIV/AIDS crisis was that there was cooperation and a lot of support and a lot of cooperation. So, you know, I'm of mixed feelings because I always feel that the sectors, when they cooperate, have to cooperate on an equal basis. Business is often so strong that when business makes a partnership with government, it's not cooperation the way it should be. You know, the greatest PPP, public-private partnership, was what Eisenhower, the president of America, called the military-industrial complex. That was a partnership between the government and private industry in the armaments industry. It wasn't a good idea, but the HIV/AIDS crisis was an example here of how people could cooperate because everybody had a friend or somebody or a relative, whether they were hemophiliacs or gay or whatever it was. Everybody had a friend, they knew somebody. So it was a crisis and it was recognized by everybody. So when it's important enough, we cooperate. Well, we need to wake up because it's becoming important enough. Just global warming itself is becoming important enough. And there are all kinds of other things. You know, the famous expression, I'll believe it when I see it. Well, now the expression should be, I'll see it when I believe it. Because if we believe and understand what's going on, we will wake up and stop the worst of it before it carries on. But so a good crisis always helps. You know, how did people get together in India to throw the British out? Was Gandhi responsible, or would there have been another Gandhi if it wasn't Gandhi? You know, and the salt marches just fired people up, and they acted, and they succeeded. What happened in the United States? People got together, they cooperated, they threw the British out too. So when people start to realize what's going on, but I also think, and we just had this discussion in our IMPM class, you know, it will take decent people across the sectors, because whether you're a business person or a government administrator or somebody working in the plural sector, like FGV is a plural sector organization. Nobody owns it. It will take the good folks, to quote my friend, it'll take the good folks working with each other, not institutionally so much, but that too, but working with each other. So there are companies that do care, and there are people in business who do care. They're not necessarily the ones who have to answer to the stock market every 3 months. But there's lots of people who do care and do things, and they have to find a way of cooperating. Gates took his private money and put it into the Plural sector and created the Gates Foundation. So it's a question of good people doing good things, and there are good people in all the sectors. There are good people in all the sectors. There are bad people in all the sectors. Hitler was a Plural sector person. So there are good and bad people in all the sectors. It's not a good answer, but when we wake up, it'll be answered.
I think it's a good answer. Thank you.
Okay.
Heinz Sadler, I'm a businessman and a student.
Good.
I'm really surprised on your position of Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
I lived in the United States and I lived in Europe. But the growing of these countries were always based also on leadership. It's my personal opinion that we all have a lack of leadership here in Brazil, which gears these efforts together in one common result. How do you see this?
Well, you may be surprised or upset by what I'm going to say. Leadership is certainly important, but communityship is much more important. The trouble with leadership is you say leader, you mean one person. One person's going to do it. We need leadership and everything will come together. And of course, it's always the answer, because if things go well, we must have had a great leader. And if things go badly, we must have had a bad leader. But you know, as I said, was Gandhi responsible for the independence of India? Well, you might be inclined to say that, but would you say George Washington was responsible for the independence of America? So was Jefferson, so was Madison, so were lots of other people. Franklin, lots of them. I believe leadership is important. I think it's important in the service of community. I think it's important in the service of community, and I'm completely against this cult of individualism, because the problem in society today is too much individualism. We need a combination of individual needs, collective needs, and community needs, and those have to be balanced. Collective needs represented by the public sector, community needs by the plural sector, and individual leadership needs by the private sector. But we need to combine them. So yes, leadership is important, but not with this obsession with individuals and some person who's going to come down from the skies and save us all. I am not a big fan of that belief. I think those people appear when a society is ready for it, and if it's not going to be one, it's going to be another. That's my belief. So yeah, I mean, there's wonderful people who've done wonderful. Cruz in Field Cruz, obviously an amazing man who created a wonderful organization, but it's never just one person.
Hi, Professor. Here. My name is Marcela, and I work in the plural sector. I have a question about jeitinho for you.
Question about?
Jeitinho,
Okay.
the word that you tried to
pronounce properly.
Yeah.
Okay.
No problem. We get it. Jeitinho is one thing that distinguishes Brazilian people and what our way to be. On one hand, it is very important to empower us to be more flexible, to face the problems and solve them. On the other hand, it makes everything, including laws, rules, very fluid and easy to disrespect. You say that it's special quality for us. So how deal with these two sides of jeitinho?
No, you're right. I mean, it's a way to cheat. It's a way to go around what public needs and so on and so forth. But it's all, you have another expression called breaking a branch, eh? Forget what's that? Yeah. I appreciate that one especially because I spent many years what we call bushwhacking on skis. going in the forest on skis, and we had to break a lot. We call it bushwhacking, not because we whack the bushes, but because the bushes whack us. Because a friend goes in front and pushes it away, and I'm behind, and bang. So we have bushwhacking. So I like that expression too. Yes, it cuts both ways. But a strong sense of community says, hey, wait a minute, I don't like that one. That's not in the spirit of what we need. And people have to speak to each other and say, sorry, we don't like that. But when people go around and find a way to beat bad forces or to beat things that are harming us, then it's good. So I like good, whatever it's called, and not bad. But of course, that's my, I have my own preferences as to what's good and what's bad. But so yes, everything has two sides. The plural sector has two sides. It's community engagement on one side, and it's Nazism on the other side, with boots and murdering people and so on. So everything has two sides, but we've got to learn how to exploit or how to make use of and explore the positive sides of these things. It's part of our tools to change the world. So you're right, not all one-sided. I agree. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Claudette. I work for the federal government, the health ministry, the regulatory agency. And I see much of ethical dimension in your ideas. You have just talked about Volkswagen and its attitude about trying to fraud the pollution control. I would like you to talk a little bit more specifically about how do you see this ethical dimension in your ideas?
Well, there's a kind of breakdown of ethics to some extent. I mean, the Volkswagen story was shocking because it was so overt. It was so calculated. It took months or years to do this, and they kept doing it. And then when the American Environmental Protection Agency challenged them, they denied it all and lied and accused them of interfering. The arrogance was mind-blowing. So there's a certain breakdown in ethics, I think, because of the greed in society. The economists have told us that greed is good. Well, if greed is good, why shouldn't I cheat? Or, as I say, because I don't know if I discussed it enough, but it's the legal corruption that bothers me. As I said, you can put criminals in jail, but legal corruption is the problem. When a chief executive of a company accepts to be paid 400 times as much as the workers, what that person is saying is, I'm 400 times more important than you. That is not leadership. That's the opposite of leadership. Those people should not be in those positions. They're announcing that they're so much more important than anybody else. And that's a form of ethical breakdown, moral breakdown. They're not breaking the law, but it's a breakdown nonetheless. And what happened with the banking in the United States after 2007, 2008, the things that were going on. I went to a panel in Davos, and the panel, Davos, the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and the panel was called the Global Corporation Savior or Scapegoat. I mean, think about that for a minute. Savior or scapegoat, some choice. So it was completely biased in its title, and they didn't even realize it, and you had major business people on that panel talking about it's a few bad apples. This was 2006, I think. It's a few bad apples. The chairman of Morgan Stanley was there. JP Morgan Chase was there talking about a few bad apples. Read about what this company was just accused of at the very time when he was making those statements. A few bad apples, but they were playing games with the mortgages. But there was a few bad apples. The world is full of a lot of bad apples these days. And as you say, if you have a bunch of apples and you put a bad one in, the other ones are going to get bad. So there's a moral decay that is awful. It's awful. You see it in your own government. Yeah, you see it in your own political parties, but you see it all over the place. and some of it is absolutely shocking. Tobacco companies that are using phony legal means to stop Asian countries from trying to stop women from smoking cigarettes. And they take them to court because there's these tribunals in the trade pacts that enable them to sue. Companies can sue governments in trade pacts for interfering with their profits. So every time Canada tries to do something about drugs, we have American pharmaceutical companies suing our government. It's completely crazy what's going on now. And then you get, I think it was Bloomberg and two very, very wealthy Americans, Bloomberg and maybe Gates, I'm not sure it was Gates, giving money to Asian governments to fight these lawsuits so they could fight against the tobacco companies. And I'm saying, why doesn't a Supreme Court, why doesn't somebody take it to a Supreme Court and say that these trade tribunals are in contradiction to our democratic rights as citizens, and no government has the right to sign a trade pact that gets in the way of our democratic rights, and throw those tribunals out in Supreme Courts and get rid of them, instead of giving money to countries to spend it. What a waste of money to spend it suing Philip Morris for what it's doing to keep women smoking. It's crazy. It's crazy what is going on in the world today. Volkswagen is just the tip of the iceberg. You don't know about icebergs here in Brazil, but in Canada we have icebergs. So.
Hello, Professor. My name is Carolina. I work with education. And when we have an expectation to balance these three sectors, I think we should also expect our community to be prepared to think, to have the knowledge and to think collectively. And do you think education has a big role in this? And how could education help us get to this plural sector where people know what they're doing?
If education teaches people to think and not write exams, then sure. If we teach people to think and look at things thoughtfully and consider things, yes. It's amazing how many intelligent, educated people don't think. We were at a dinner party the other night, and this was a lawyer who was a very successful lawyer, and we have an election campaign going on now, and the Conservative Party is trying to say that the head of the Liberal Party is too inexperienced and isn't capable and isn't strong enough and he's not ready, and so on and so forth. It's negative advertising, and he repeated all that. That's why we can't elect the Liberal Party. And I thought, have you listened to the guy himself? Have you listened to what he's saying? Because he's very impressive. But the Conservatives are trying to paint him as incapable and too young, and so on. And yet when you listen to him, he's quite amazing, and he surprises people who are against him who listen. This guy never bothered to listen to him. Never bothered to listen to him. He bought the dogma. We have too much of that. I don't want people to be left or right or anything else. I simply want them to think. And as I was sort of suggesting before, I know people who are right of center, but they think. They think. One of my friends calls himself moderately conservative, and he loves my book. He loves my book because he thinks that he's American. He thinks the fat cats, as he put it, have taken over, and he wants the good people of America to act. Just want people to think, that's all.
Okay. This will be the last question because Professor Mintzberg has a very busy agenda. So, okay, go on.
I'm Lucia Mazzoni from the state government. Considering your concerns about the current directions from Brazil, do you think that the responsibility to be more plural is relying on government because of the legislations and so on, or do you think this is a mixed responsibility there to be more plural?
For Brazil, the people in general, to be more plural. It's interesting because, you know, there are some countries, France, I think, is like that. I'm a huge fan of France. I spent years and years living in France. And yet I think when something becomes popular in France, almost everybody follows it. You know, in America, if you didn't watch the Super Bowl, to talk in the office about the Super Bowl, kind of what's wrong with you? You're not like, you know, there's a certain conformity in those two countries. I don't get a feeling of conformity here. I get a feeling of very widespread pluralism, which is, I think a lot of people just think for themselves. They work it out. They figure it out for themselves. I think the British are like that. I think the Indians are like that in India. The educated people really think for themselves. So you want plurality of thought, but you want people to think about things and be educated to think about things and not to buy, you know, dogma. You know, if you study economics in the traditional way, somehow you're supposed to believe that markets are wonderful and governments are terrible. We'll get rid of the police force. We'll get rid of the army. I went to a party in Virginia, and it was in rural Virginia, and there were a lot of kind of very right-wing people there, and they were all kind of around me talking about how bad government is and how bad taxes are. And at one point I said, every one of you spent your career in the military. Every one of you is on pension from the military. You never earned 1 cent that didn't come from taxes. And it never occurred to them. It never occurred to them that they would never have earned 1 penny in their whole lives if not for taxes. And yet they were going on and on about taxes and government, and they were government employees. It's crazy. It's just crazy. You know, after this latest shooting in the United States, they interviewed a young woman who was right near it and was traumatized by it. And they said, so what do you think we should do? And she said, oh, we need more guns. We definitely need more guns so that we can kill these people. I don't know anybody who engaged in mass killing who was shot by a local person. They were all shot by the police. So everybody's supposed to have guns. Well, where are all these guns when these people are shooting people? They're doing the killing. They're not killing the terrorists. It's awful. People buy this nonsense and they don't think. It's very dangerous.
It's fantastic. I'd like then to thank you, Professor Mintzberg, for this fantastic speech and this very open discussion. And I'd like just to invite everybody for a cocktail outside this room. Thank you very much. Trying to make